Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's turn to the other side where Ron DeSantis hit some of these populist notes trying to appeal to former President Trump's voters. Here he is in his speech talking about how his economic plan will take on China.
The abusive relationship, the asymmetric relationship between our two countries must come to an end. No more massive trade deficits, no more importing of goods with stolen intellectual property, no more preferential trade status. We need to incentivize the repatriation of American capital and investment here in the United States so we can recapture our supply chains and build a strong, durable industrial base. And in Florida, we've actually taken action against the CCP. We have banned the purchase of land in Florida by members of the Chinese Communist Party or its affiliates.
Kate, some of that, the intellectual property theft, seems fair to me, but then the question is, how is the U.S. going to respond, and is that going to be effective? On the point about repatriating capital, here's the line from the DeSantis plan. It says, DeSantis will incentivize the repatriation of U.S. capital from China through strategic tax abatements. And so it's hard to know what exactly he means, but it sounds like giving certain breaks to certain companies that pledge to bring certain jobs or capital or equipment back. And boy, I think we've had a long history of that not working.
Well, right, Kyle. I mean, we're just having a long conversation about making the tax code more functional, more clean, having fewer carve-outs for big business. And now we're talking about putative strategic tax abatements, whatever they may look like, to move capital back to the United States. And you remember how much capital moved back to the United States after a large corporate tax cut. There are other levers you can use that are not such blatant tax carve-outs. I'd add that there was a bit of confusion on China in general. To your point, some of those proposals may make sense. The trade deficit with China has been falling, and I think that is not the right metric to focus on. One thing that I would have liked to seen from Ron DeSantis on China would be kind of a theory of American economic influence in Asia. Donald Trump is attacking DeSantis for supporting the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a large trade deal with America and other countries in Asia. Now, I think that a candidate could go out and make the case that the United States agreeing with a lot of other friendly nations in Asia to trade goods without tariffs and barriers would be a good thing for U.S. influence, and to leave China out of it would check their influence. That is a case that you could be made to the public that DeSantis isn't making. And what has ended him up with is in this position where Trump is attacking him for having supported the partnership in the first place. And now he's sort of trying to backtrack and go with some of these policies that are more popular with some of the populist right. And what he could have done instead was simply defend his record on that and shown some leadership on free trade to a party that I think can be persuaded. And especially now in the intervening years since the partnership moved on without the U.S., China has become more of a threat. There's more of an argument for it. So I do think that there's an argument here for sticking to your guns on some of this and not simply kind of going with whatever seems to be in fashion on the time. And as a practical matter, it just leaves you open to attack from Trump. I just had one other quick observation here, which is just, I noticed the DeSantis campaign using the tagline, "We win, they lose." And I was initially very interested to see this because most listeners may know it's a Reagan line that Reagan used to describe his strategy with the Soviet Union. And it was his idea that the U.S. could overcome the Soviet Union. And at the time, that was really against conventional theory, which is just, manage decline against the Soviet Union and not really prevail. But now DeSantis is using this line to describe this sort of broad contest between America and the elites, America and China, and the Communist Party, and America and the family versus the elites. I mean, it is a confusion as opposed to a piece of clarity on his thinking. He kind of seems to want that Reagan legacy and to benefit from it, but there's no such Reagan legacy without that clarity and that political courage to lead on some of these issues like trade. And so I think that's kind of something DeSantis has to think about.
To the point about we win, they lose, it does raise the question, who is we and who is they? And Kim, to Kate's point, they sometimes seems to be the bureaucracy, sometimes seems to be, quote, large corporations, sometimes seems to be the Chinese Communist Party. It is a lot of rhetoric without a lot of specificity. And then on the point about opening himself up to attack, President Trump is pointing out quotes, for example, from Governor DeSantis in 2018 saying, I'm not somebody that advocates tariffs. I want to have lower barriers and I want to have free trade. And I think it's generally true if you go back and look at the stances he took and the things he said when he was in the House, he sounded more like an old Tea Party guy. And now that he's taking this populist turn, I think it does raise a question in at least some voters' minds of what does Ron DeSantis really believe?
Yeah, there's always a risk when you are changing your positions, especially if it looks as though you're catering to voters. I mean, sometimes it's when voters change their minds and you are there with the party. But this is very much aimed at a certain segment of voters. Again, those that are already fairly tightly allied to Donald Trump. So I'm still not entirely sure Ron DeSantis's attempt here to just be focused so much on getting these voters when there's such a huge portion of the party that is outside of that category that is still up for grabs, especially among the other candidates that are out there. I mean, the other problem with this is that when you go down this road, you end up adopting policies that are in conflict with each other. And I mentioned this earlier. So if you're going to take on this populist rhetoric and say, I'm against corporate America, okay, well, first of all, the problem is you're also talking about unleashing the economy to do better. Obviously, a lot of corporations are central to that. So are you going to hamstring them? Are you going to help them? Similarly, I saw that he gave an interview with the Wall Street Journal yesterday on our news side. And this is also where that kind of desire to say that you are opposed to corporate America can come into conflict with your, for instance, like anti-China policy, because in the end, who do you decide you dislike more? And in this case, in this interview, Ron DeSantis was asked about industrial policy, basically having the government give more aid to what we call, quote, critical sectors, like the giant semiconductor giveaway that Congress recently approved. Not necessary, but that we got this. It was all done under the guise of we must compete with China. We must do everything to keep this industry here. And so you end up cutting billion-dollar checks to Intel, corporate America of all places. And he was asked about this and he said, well, I wouldn't get carried away. That was his quote. He said that he didn't want government to play venture capital, but he left the door open saying, well, that would be different for things that are a matter of national survival. Okay, the problem with that is that everyone in Washington thinks that their particular industry in their state is a matter of national survival. You could very easily start having Congress making plans for all kinds of dollars going to all kinds of industries. And let's just be clear, those are corporate handouts. So is China the problem? Is corporate America the problem? You can't sit there and talk about how government's spending too much and then leave the door open to spending more on certain industries. You end up going down a rabbit hole. Much better to be very clear about what you're attempting to accomplish here and your consistent principles on how you do that.
Kate, we'll give you the last word, but plenty of time here, even before the first debate, much less anyone starts voting. Ron DeSantis has a lot of room that he can adjust and put out some additional policies. It may be a reset of the reset if it comes to that. But I do think that there's a marked change here for the better in the way he seems to be approaching this campaign. And perhaps he will go further in that direction.
Yes. I mean, there's lots in this plan that he could flesh out and double down on that I think would be worthwhile and substantive. I mean, to your point about a tax plan and exactly how we'd simplify the code, that would be a good debate. Work requirements, U.S. energy production. These are unambiguously pro-growth policies that he can run on and explain to people how he will use them to make their living standards higher and make the country more prosperous. So I think there are real things to build on. The last one too, I mean, the education piece is such an opportunity. DeSantis has a record of credibility, especially from being governor of Florida and having kept the schools open during COVID-19. He's also had a lot to say about what schools are teaching and been willing to fight on some questions of that in the schools, even when they're not popular. I mean, that's a record he can bring to bear in a larger conversation about how the education system is not serving American kids, and we need more ability for parents to choose what schools their kids go to. I mean, that alone is a whole theme there that I think is so potent that he could spend a lot of time on. And that is an example of where some of those views that might be described as populist line up with a policy that is really beneficial from the country and good for growth. So I think there's real rich minds to vein here if he picks the right ones.
Thank you, Kate and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com.